Let's bring in our markets reporter, Josh Schafer, who has been closely tracking this. And Josh, we are certainly seeing a lot of investors digging in and buying some of those names that have been beaten down.
Yeah, Shawnee, you did see some dip buying specifically in the tech sector and really in the indexes overall. So I want to start with the indexes because I think there's some intuitiveness to take out of this of what people were saying when we had that sell-off on August 5th. So your indexes there are in yellow and orange. The S&P and Nasdaq are now positive since that sell-off on August 5th. And you think back to what a lot of strategists we had on air that day were saying is understand why the market is falling today and does that change your thesis? And I think for a lot of investors, it didn't actually change their thesis. As we've talked about over the last week, a lot of the fall in the market had to do with the unwinding of a yen carry trade, which I think most investors probably don't even understand what that means on its surface. They probably don't even need to understand what it means on its surface, right?
I talk about it at the barbecue all the time,
right,
Josh.
Yeah, right. We're talking about how we want to use leverage to buy all these things, right? But if you're not using leverage, then maybe it just doesn't matter to you, and maybe you shouldn't be worried. And if what's happening isn't a thesis changer, then maybe just stay in the market. And that's played out for investors that stayed in the market. On the tech side, we had a large tech sell-off leading into the bigger market sell-off. And then what happened was you saw at that point the Nasdaq enters correction territory down 10%. And all of a sudden everyone says the risk reward looks a little bit better now. After this big sell-off, maybe it's a time to get back into tech stocks. And Shauna, I know that's something you had been talking to strategists about and saying, maybe it's time to be a dip buyer at the start of last week.
Yeah, and what I think is so interesting, and we'll ask Drew Pettit over at Citi this question later on this morning, but now I wonder how they're viewing the current valuations, because yes, they're still more attractive than maybe they had been just in terms of if you compare it to where they had been earlier this year, but still though, after this massive climb, is there now a reason to sell, or are they finding reason to hold on to these names because the narrative has sort of shifted in the market just in terms of what we could be expecting with the Fed and rate cuts and how exactly that's all going to play out? So I think that's going to be so interesting too, to see how people are feeling here today.
The easy buying is definitely over, right? So Keith Lerner over at Truist, who had upgraded the tech sector last week, he did some great work highlighting the the tech sector's outperformance in the S&P 500 in June. On a rolling 2-month basis, it was the best the tech sector had ever done versus the S&P 500 since 2002. Then you spin that forward to the sell-off, it was the worst the tech sector had done against the S&P 500 since 2002. So you had this big dichotomy there, and then so it's easy to come in to some extent, easier, or at least a bit more obvious, I guess I should say, to come in and say, okay, now tech looks a little bit oversold, but now we're past those levels. And now the question is, okay, what did we actually hear from those earnings?
Yeah.
And do we feel confident in the earnings growth trajectory moving forward?
Yeah, and I also think going off that, just what exactly is going to be that catalyst for future growth and what that future growth looks like.
Nvidia earnings. We still have Nvidia earnings, guys.
So much, yes, exactly. So much is riding on Nvidia earnings. What happens if they disappoint? What happens if they just come in line with expectations? Because we've seen the fact that obviously the market has not been satisfied with that in the past.
We said last quarter, Nvidia earnings were the biggest deal ever, right? We wrote about it and talked about it for a week, and then the market didn't do anything.
Yeah.
The market actually went down, I think, in the couple
So
days
then what does that
after.
tell us? That doesn't sound too good then maybe for some of these tech stocks.
Yeah, I think the broader question will continue to be, you're going to hear this 493 versus Mag 7 conversation continue to really lead what people are talking about. And the question being there, okay, if I'm looking to outperform the index in the final months of the year, is tech the smart place to be? Because is there enough future gains within that, or is this rotation going to be where I can outperform the S&P 500 to end 2024, right? That's what a lot of these strategists are really talking about here, is to get a little bit of alpha.